The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as Catherine stood by the tall windows of their private quarters. Her fingers traced the cool glass while she watched the gardeners tending to the roses below. These same roses had bloomed for decades, witnessing countless moments of joy and sorrow within the royal walls. Today felt different, though. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on her shoulders. William entered quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He had just returned from a lengthy meeting with palace advisors, and the strain showed clearly on his face. The discussions had been difficult, filled with conversations about duty, responsibility, and choices that would affect not just their family, but the entire Commonwealth. He paused near the doorway, watching his wife's silhouette against the morning light. "The children are asking questions," Catherine said softly without turning around. "Charlotte wanted to know why there are so many reporters at the gates. George keeps asking if we're going on a long holiday." Her voice carried a mixture of concern and determination that William knew so well. Moving closer, William placed his hands gently on her shoulders. They had faced many challenges together over the years, but this situation felt uniquely complex. The public scrutiny had intensified beyond anything they had previously experienced. Every move they made was analyzed, every expression photographed and studied by millions of people around the world. The couple had spent countless hours in private discussions, weighing their options carefully. Their marriage had always been built on mutual respect and shared values, but recent circumstances had tested even their strongest foundations. The pressure from various directions seemed endless, from the palace, from the media, from well-meaning family members, and from a public that felt deeply invested in their lives. Catherine finally turned to face her husband. Her eyes, usually bright with warmth, held a sadness that cut straight through him. They had been together for so many years, through university days filled with laughter and dreams, through the early days of their relationship when privacy was still possible, through their fairy tale wedding that captivated the world, and through the beautiful chaos of raising 3 young children in the most public family on earth. "I never imagined it would become this complicated," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. The gesture was tender, familiar, yet somehow felt different in this moment. William closed his eyes briefly, leaning into her touch. These quiet moments between them had become increasingly precious as their public duties expanded and private time became a luxury. The phone on the mahogany desk buzzed insistently, but neither of them moved to answer it. They knew it would be another request for a statement, another interview opportunity, another chance to explain themselves to a world that felt entitled to every detail of their private struggles. The constant demands had become suffocating, leaving little room for the simple pleasures they once enjoyed together. "Do you remember our first official engagement after we were married?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A small smile crossed Catherine's face as the memory surfaced. They had been so nervous, so eager to do everything perfectly. The public had welcomed her with such warmth and enthusiasm. She had felt genuinely hopeful about her role and the positive impact they could make together. Those early days seemed like a different lifetime now. The enthusiasm was still there, but it was tempered by years of experience, by understanding the true weight of their positions, and by the realization that some problems couldn't be solved simply through good intentions and hard work. The institution they served was ancient and complex, with traditions and expectations that sometimes felt impossibly rigid. William pulled her closer, and they stood together in silence, drawing strength from each other's presence. Through the windows, they could see the gathering crowd of photographers and reporters at the palace gates. The attention had been relentless for weeks, with every major news outlet sending their best correspondents to cover what many were calling a pivotal moment for the modern monarchy. The children's voices echoed from somewhere in the vast palace as they played with their nanny. Louis's infectious laughter carried through the halls, a sound that never failed to bring joy to both parents. These innocent moments reminded them of what truly mattered, of the family they had built together despite the extraordinary circumstances of their lives. Catherine stepped back slightly, her hand still resting on William's chest. "Whatever happens next," she said with quiet determination, "we face it together. We've always been a team, and that won't change now." Her words carried the strength that had made her such a beloved figure, the same strength that had helped her navigate the transition from a relatively normal life to one lived entirely in the public eye. William nodded, his own resolve strengthening. They had weathered many storms together, had learned to find moments of normalcy within their extraordinary existence. Their love story had captivated the world from the beginning, but it was so much more than the fairy tale that people imagined. It was built on real partnership, genuine affection, and shared commitment to something larger than themselves. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the room where so many important conversations had taken place. This space had witnessed their private celebrations, their quiet worries about the children, their discussions about charity work and public appearances. It had been their sanctuary, a place where they could simply be William and Catherine rather than the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. As they prepared to face whatever the day would bring, both understood that they were entering uncharted territory. The decisions ahead would require courage, wisdom, and the kind of unity that had sustained their relationship through every previous challenge. The world was indeed holding its breath, waiting to see how this chapter of their story would unfold. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, and the weight of history seemed to settle around them like a heavy cloak. But in this moment, in their private sanctuary, they were simply two people who had found something precious in each other, preparing to face the future with whatever strength their love could provide. The grand dining room felt unusually quiet that evening as the family gathered for dinner, usually filled with animated conversations about school projects, favorite books, and weekend plans. Tonight, the children seemed to sense the underlying tension that had settled over the household like morning fog. George, now old enough to understand that something significant was happening, kept glancing between his parents with curious eyes. Charlotte, ever the perceptive one, had been unusually clingy throughout the day. She had insisted on helping her mother choose jewelry that morning, a ritual they both enjoyed. But even that familiar routine felt different somehow. The little girl's intuition seemed to pick up on subtleties that adults might miss, and she had stayed close to Catherine's side whenever possible. Louis, blissfully unaware of the complex adult world swirling around him, continued to be his cheerful, energetic self. His innocent chatter about his toy cars and favorite snacks provided welcome moments of lightness during an otherwise heavy day. William found himself treasuring these simple interactions, storing them in his memory like precious photographs. After the children were settled for the night, their bedtime stories read and their rooms filled with the soft glow of nightlights, William and Catherine retreated to the library. This room had always been their favorite retreat, lined with books that told stories of adventure, love, and triumph over adversity. The leather chairs by the fireplace had witnessed countless conversations between them over the years. Catherine curled up in her usual spot, pulling a soft cashmere throw around her shoulders. The weight of the day's decisions pressed down on both of them, but there was also a strange sense of clarity emerging from the confusion. Sometimes the most difficult choices were also the most necessary ones, even when they led down paths that seemed impossible to imagine just months before. "I keep thinking about your mother," Catherine said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. William's expression softened at the mention of Diana. Her memory was always present in their lives, but particularly during times of struggle and change. The parallels were impossible to ignore, though their situation was uniquely their own. William nodded slowly, understanding exactly what his wife meant. Diana had faced her own impossible choices, had navigated her own complex relationship with duty and personal happiness. Her story had ended tragically, but the lessons from her experience continued to guide them, even in circumstances she could never have imagined. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, they could hear the distant sounds of London continuing its ancient rhythm, unaware of the momentous decisions being made within the palace walls. Millions of people went about their evening routines, but for William and Catherine, this night would mark a turning point they would remember forever. "The statement is ready," William said, referring to the carefully crafted words that had taken days to perfect. Every sentence had been analyzed, every phrase considered for its impact on various audiences. The palace communications team had worked tirelessly to find language that would be honest yet diplomatic, clear yet respectful of all the complex relationships involved. Catherine reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become second nature over their years together. This simple touch conveyed more than words ever could, expressing support, understanding, and unshakable partnership. They had learned to communicate in these quiet moments, finding strength in each other that they couldn't find anywhere else. The gravity of their decisions settled around them like evening mist. They understood that tomorrow would bring intense scrutiny, endless analysis, and probably criticism from various quarters. The media machine would dissect every word, every gesture, every perceived meaning behind their carefully chosen language. The public reaction would be swift and passionate, with supporters and critics making their voices heard across every platform imaginable. But beneath all the external noise, there was something else, a sense of authenticity that had been missing for months. The constant pressure to maintain appearances, to never show weakness or uncertainty, had been exhausting in ways that few people could understand. The freedom to speak their truth, even if it was difficult or unpopular, felt like finally being able to breathe deeply after holding their breath for too long. William stood and moved to the window, looking out over the grounds where security lights created pools of brightness in the darkness. He thought about his father, his grandmother, and all the generations of his family who had faced their own moments of crisis and decision. Each had found their own way of balancing personal needs with public duty, though not all had managed to do so successfully. "Are we being selfish?" he asked, voicing the question that had haunted both of them. It was the concern that kept them awake at night, the worry that perhaps they were putting their own desires ahead of their responsibilities to something much larger than themselves. The monarchy represented continuity, stability, and service to millions of people who looked to it for strength and guidance. Catherine considered the question carefully before answering. She had spent years thinking about duty and sacrifice, about what it meant to serve others, and what happened when that service came at too high a personal cost. The answer wasn't simple, and she knew that reasonable people could disagree about their choices. "I think," she said slowly, "that we can only serve others authentically when we're true to ourselves. If we pretend to be something we're not, if we sacrifice our core values for the sake of appearances, then we're not really serving anyone well." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had learned hard lessons about the difference between genuine service and mere performance. The hours passed, quietly as they sat together, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in comfortable silence. These were the moments that had sustained their relationship through every challenge, the quiet times when they could simply be themselves without cameras, without protocols, without the weight of expectation that followed them everywhere else. As midnight approached, they finally acknowledged that tomorrow would arrive whether they felt ready or not. The statement would be released, the world would react, and their lives would change in ways they couldn't fully predict. But they would face it all together, as they had faced everything else since their student days at St. Andrews. The decision was made, and with it came a mixture of fear and relief that felt both terrifying and liberating. They were stepping into unknown territory, leaving behind the familiar patterns that had defined their lives for years. But sometimes the most important journeys required the courage to leave comfortable surroundings and venture into uncertainty, trusting that love and commitment would light the way forward. The morning arrived with unusual stillness, as if the entire world was holding its breath before the storm. Catherine woke before dawn, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She moved quietly through their private quarters, careful not to disturb William, who had finally fallen into restless sleep just hours before. The palace felt different somehow, charged with an energy that seemed to pulse through the ancient walls. The staff went about their morning routines with professional efficiency, but Catherine noticed the subtle signs of tension in their carefully neutral expressions. These people had served the royal family for years, some for decades, and they understood the significance of what was about to unfold. Their discretion was absolute, but their concern was unmistakable to someone who knew how to read the small signs. By 7 in the morning, the media presence outside the gates had grown substantially. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like electronic flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters stood ready with microphones, their faces serious with the weight of covering what many were already calling a historic moment. The world's attention was focused on this one location, waiting for words that would reshape understanding of duty, love, and the modern monarchy. William joined Catherine in their private sitting room, where breakfast had been laid out with typical palace precision. The morning newspapers were stacked neatly on a silver tray, their headlines speculating wildly about what might be announced. Neither of them felt much appetite, but they went through the motions of eating, understanding that they would need their strength for the challenges ahead. "The children?" William asked quietly, knowing that their primary concern was always for George, Charlotte, and Louis. "How do you explain to young minds that sometimes adults must make choices that seem to contradict everything they've been taught about duty and permanence? How do you help them understand that love sometimes requires difficult decisions?" "They're having breakfast with their nanny," Catherine replied. "I thought we should speak with them together, after everything is public." The decision to shield their children from the immediate chaos while still being honest with them reflected the delicate balance they tried to maintain between protection and transparency. The palace communications director arrived precisely at 9, carrying the final version of the statement that would soon be released to the world. The words had been crafted with extraordinary care, each sentence designed to convey respect for the institution they were leaving while explaining their reasons for departure. It was a document that attempted to bridge the gap between personal truth and public responsibility. Reading through the statement one final time, both William and Catherine felt the weight of history settling around them. These words would be analyzed by scholars, debated by politicians, and remembered by future generations as a turning point in the long story of the British monarchy. The language was formal yet personal, respectful yet honest about the challenges they had faced. At 10:30, the statement was released simultaneously to all major news outlets, social media platforms, and government officials. The reaction was immediate and intense, as predicted. Within minutes, the story was spreading across the globe, translated into dozens of languages and shared millions of times. The modern world's hunger for instant information meant that their carefully chosen words were being dissected and debated before they had time to process the magnitude of what they had just done. The phones in the palace communications office began ringing incessantly. Interview requests poured in from every major media organization on Earth. Publishers offered enormous sums for book deals. Documentary filmmakers proposed unprecedented access in exchange for their exclusive story. The commercial machinery that surrounds modern celebrity kicked into overdrive, seeing opportunity in what was, for William and Catherine, simply an attempt to find a more authentic way to live. But in their private quarters, away from the chaos of public reaction, the couple experienced a strange sense of calm. The decision had been made, the words had been spoken, and there was no going back now. Sometimes the most difficult step is the first one, and they had finally taken it, despite all the fears and uncertainties that had kept them paralyzed for months. Catherine stood once again by the tall windows, but this time her posture was different. The weight that had pressed down on her shoulders seemed to have lifted slightly. She was still the same person who had married Prince William in Westminster Abbey, still the mother who read bedtime stories and worried about scraped knees and school friendships. But now she was also someone who had found the courage to choose her own path, even when that path led away from everything she had known. William joined her at the window, and together they watched the media circus unfolding beyond the palace gates. The scene was surreal. Hundreds of people whose job was to document and interpret their lives, all focused on this single moment of transition. The attention was overwhelming, but it was also temporary. Eventually, the world would move on to other stories. Other crises, other moments of human drama played out on the public stage. "I keep thinking about what comes next," William said, voicing the question that neither of them could fully answer. They had spent so much energy making this decision that they hadn't had time to fully imagine the life that lay beyond it. Freedom was a wonderful concept, but it was also terrifying for people who had lived their entire adult lives within the structured environment of royal duty. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Their private secretary entered with updates on the global reaction to their announcement. World leaders were issuing statements of support or disappointment. Religious figures were offering prayers and guidance. Fellow royals from other countries were expressing solidarity or concern. The response was as complex and varied as the world itself. What struck both of them most powerfully was the reaction from ordinary people whose lives had been touched in some way by their public service. Teachers wrote about school visits that had inspired their students. Charity workers shared stories of causes that had received crucial attention. Veterans spoke about feeling honored by royal recognition of their sacrifice. These responses reminded them that their years of service had created real positive impact. Regardless of how their story was ending, As the afternoon wore on, they began the difficult process of explaining their decision to family members who hadn't been involved in the final deliberations. These conversations were painful, filled with expressions of disappointment, concern, and sometimes anger. The family they were leaving behind felt betrayed in some ways, unable to understand how duty could be abandoned for personal fulfillment. But there were also unexpected voices of support. Relatives who had struggled with their own roles within the royal framework expressed private relief that someone had finally been brave enough to choose authenticity over appearance. The conversations revealed long-hidden tensions and frustrations within the family structure, suggesting that William and Catherine's decision might open space for broader changes in how the monarchy functioned in the modern world. By evening, the initial media frenzy had begun to settle into more thoughtful analysis and commentary. The story would continue for weeks and months, but the immediate shock was wearing off, replaced by deeper questions about duty, sacrifice, and the price of public service in the 21st century. William and Catherine had started a conversation that would continue long after they had stepped away from its center. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of changes that neither William nor Catherine could have fully prepared for, despite their months of planning. The logistics of separating their lives from the royal institution proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. Every official relationship, every charity patronage, every ceremonial role had to be carefully unwound with respect for all the people and organizations involved. Their children adapted to the changes with the remarkable resilience that young minds often display, though not without questions and occasional confusion. George, being the eldest, seemed to understand that their family was entering a new chapter, even if he couldn't grasp all the implications. Charlotte threw herself into her usual activities with even more enthusiasm, as if trying to maintain normalcy through sheer force of will. Louis, blessedly oblivious to most of the adult complexities, continued to find joy in simple pleasures and everyday adventures. The process of finding a new home outside the royal residences became an unexpected adventure. After years of living in palaces with staff to handle every detail, the prospect of choosing their own furniture, arranging their own schedules, and managing their own household felt both exciting and overwhelming. Catherine found herself spending hours researching schools, neighborhood amenities, and the kind of ordinary concerns that had been handled by others for so long. William threw himself into understanding the practical aspects of their new life with characteristic thoroughness. Banking, insurance, grocery shopping, and all the mundane details that most adults take for granted required careful attention. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that learning to live a normal life required significant effort and planning after years in the highly structured royal environment. The public reaction continued to evolve as the initial shock wore off and people had time to process what had happened. Some praised their courage in choosing authenticity over obligation. Others criticized them for abandoning their responsibilities to the British people and the Commonwealth. The debate played out in newspapers, on social media, and in countless conversations around dinner tables across the world. What surprised both William and Catherine was the number of people who shared their own stories of choosing difficult paths for the sake of personal integrity. Teachers who had left secure positions to pursue their true calling. Business executives who had walked away from lucrative careers that didn't align with their values. And parents who had made sacrifices to spend more time with their children, all found ways to express solidarity with the royal couple's decision. The letters and messages of support came from unexpected places. A grandmother in Scotland wrote about the importance of showing children that adults can change course when necessary. A young father in Australia shared his own struggle to balance career ambitions with family time. A retired nurse in Canada expressed gratitude for their years of service, while supporting their right to choose a different future. These personal connections reminded them that their story resonated far beyond the world of royal protocol and constitutional law. Financial independence became a central concern as they worked to establish their new life. The transition from royal funding to self-sufficiency required careful planning and creative thinking. Publishing deals, speaking engagements, and consultation work offered potential income streams, but they were determined to avoid exploiting their royal connections in ways that might seem inappropriate or mercenary. Catherine discovered a passion for interior design as they worked to create their first truly private home. Without the constraints of royal protocol or the weight of historical preservation, she could finally express her personal taste and create spaces that reflected their family's actual needs and preferences. The process became therapeutic, a way of literally building the foundation for their new life together. William found unexpected satisfaction in handling mundane tasks like researching car insurance and comparing utility providers. These small acts of ordinary adult responsibility represented freedom in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every decision they made for themselves, no matter how trivial it might seem, was a step toward authentic independence. The children's schools presented both opportunities and challenges. Finding institutions that could provide excellent education while respecting the family's desire for privacy required extensive research and careful negotiations. The goal was to give George, Charlotte, and Louis as normal an educational experience as possible, while acknowledging that their backgrounds would always make them somewhat unique among their peers. Social relationships began to shift in interesting ways. Some long-standing friendships deepened as the pressure of royal protocol was removed, allowing for more authentic connections. Others became strained as people struggled to understand how to relate to William and Catherine in their new roles. The process of discovering who their true friends were proved both revealing and sometimes painful. The media attention, while intense, began to change in character as well. The initial feeding frenzy of speculation and analysis gradually gave way to more thoughtful coverage of their transition. Photographers still followed their movements, but there seemed to be slightly more respect for their attempts to establish privacy for their family life. Professional opportunities began to emerge that aligned with their values and interests in ways that royal duty hadn't always allowed. Catherine received offers to collaborate on children's education initiatives that could benefit from her unique perspective and experience. William was approached about conservation, projects that could draw on his passion for environmental protection without the constraints of political neutrality that had limited his previous advocacy. The most unexpected aspect of their new life was the sense of possibility that began to emerge. For years, their future had been clearly mapped out by tradition, protocol, and constitutional requirements. Now, while still uncertain in many ways, their path was theirs to choose. The freedom to make mistakes, to change direction, and to follow their instincts felt both liberating and terrifying. As spring turned to summer, the rhythm of their new life began to establish itself. Weekend trips to farmers' markets replaced ceremonial events. Parent-teacher conferences took the place of state dinners. Helping with homework became more important than reviewing briefing papers. These changes weren't just about lifestyle. They represented a fundamental shift in priorities and values. The couple began to understand that their decision had been about more than just leaving royal life. It had been about claiming the right to define their own version of service, their own understanding of duty, and their own approach to making a positive impact in the world. The institutions they had served would continue without them, but they would find new ways to contribute that felt more authentic to their evolving sense of purpose and identity. 6 months after their decision to step back from royal life, William and Catherine found themselves in completely unfamiliar territory. Their new home, a beautifully restored farmhouse in the Cotswolds, was finally beginning to feel like a true sanctuary, rather than just another temporary residence. The morning routine had settled into something wonderfully ordinary, Catherine making breakfast while William helped the children get ready for school, all of them moving through their day without the careful choreography that had defined their previous existence. The children had adapted remarkably well to their new school, though it hadn't been without challenges. George initially struggled with the attention from classmates who couldn't quite treat him like any other student, but gradually the novelty wore off and genuine friendships began to form. Charlotte threw herself into new activities with characteristic determination, joining the school choir and developing a passion for pottery that left clay under her fingernails and joy in her eyes. Louis, now old enough for proper school rather than just nursery, delighted in the simple pleasure of walking to class with his siblings rather than being driven in official cars. The transformation in their daily life was profound in ways both large and small. Catherine discovered the peculiar satisfaction of doing her own grocery shopping, learning to navigate crowded supermarkets, and remember to bring the reusable bags. William found unexpected pleasure in mundane tasks like mowing their own lawn and fixing a squeaky gate, activities that connected him to the physical world in ways that ceremonial duties never had. Their relationship with money took on new dimensions as they learned to budget and plan for expenses that had once been handled automatically by royal accounts. The process was educational and occasionally stressful, but it also brought a sense of control and responsibility that felt empowering. Every purchase was now a conscious choice rather than something managed by others on their behalf. Work began to take shape in forms they had never imagined during their royal years. Catherine accepted a position consulting for a children's mental health charity, using her years of experience with public outreach to help develop more effective programs. The work was challenging and meaningful, but what she valued most was being judged on her actual contributions rather than her title or connections. William found himself drawn to environmental consulting, working with businesses and organizations that wanted to reduce their ecological impact. His royal background provided initial credibility, but his growing expertise and genuine passion for the work proved to be what really mattered. The projects were complex and sometimes frustrating, but the problems felt solvable in ways that broader social issues hadn't during his royal service. The media attention, while still present, had begun to settle into more manageable patterns. There were still photographers who followed their movements, but the frenzy of the early months had calmed considerably. More importantly, they had learned to navigate public spaces with confidence, developing strategies for maintaining privacy while still living openly in their community. Their social life evolved in unexpected directions as they formed friendships with neighbors, parents from the children's school, and colleagues from their new professional endeavors. These relationships were refreshingly uncomplicated, built on shared interests and genuine compatibility rather than protocol or mutual obligation. Dinner parties at their home became relaxed, affairs where conversation flowed naturally without the careful attention to precedence and etiquette that had structured their previous social interactions. The most surprising aspect of their new life was how much they had learned about themselves. Without the constant structure of royal duties and expectations, they discovered interests and capabilities that had been dormant for years. Catherine found she had a talent for home renovation, spending weekends researching architectural history and learning to refinish furniture. William developed an unexpected passion for cooking, experimenting with recipes and taking pride in preparing meals for his family. Their marriage, which had weathered the pressures of royal life with remarkable strength, flourished in this new environment. The constant scrutiny and formal requirements that had shaped their public interactions for years gradually gave way to more natural expressions of affection and partnership. They could now be spontaneous in ways that had been impossible when every gesture was photographed and analyzed for hidden meanings. The children began to see their parents in new ways as well. Instead of figures who appeared between official duties and public engagements, they now had access to adults who were present and available for the small moments that make up daily life. Homework help, bedtime stories, and weekend adventures became regular features rather than special occasions squeezed between royal obligations. Professional recognition began to come in forms they hadn't expected. Catherine's work with the children's mental health charity earned respect from colleagues who valued her insights and dedication rather than her celebrity status. William's environmental consulting projects began to produce measurable results, earning him credibility in a field where expertise mattered more than pedigree. The financial aspects of their new life stabilized as they found their footing in unfamiliar territory. Book deals and speaking engagements provided income, but they were selective about opportunities, choosing only those that aligned with their values and allowed them to share meaningful experiences rather than simply capitalize on their royal connections. Community involvement took on new meaning as they became genuine residents of their area rather than visiting dignitaries. Catherine joined the local parent-teacher association, contributing to fundraising efforts and school improvement projects with the same energy she had once devoted to royal patronages. William volunteered with a local conservation group, spending weekends clearing hiking trails and monitoring wildlife populations. The couple began to understand that their decision had been about much more than leaving royal life. It had been about reclaiming agency over their own story, For years, their narrative had been shaped by external expectations, constitutional requirements, and institutional needs. Now they were free to write their own chapters, to make mistakes and learn from them, to pursue interests that might lead nowhere or might become passionate causes. Sleep came more easily now, without the weight of tomorrow's official duties pressing down on them each night. They could make spontaneous plans, change their minds about weekend activities, and respond to their children's needs without consulting schedules planned months in advance. The luxury of flexibility, of being able to say yes to unexpected opportunities or no to obligations that didn't serve their family, felt revolutionary after years of carefully managed time. As they looked ahead to their second year of independence, both William and Catherine felt a growing confidence in their choices. The transition had been more difficult than they had anticipated, but also more rewarding. They were building something entirely their own, a life that honored their past experiences while allowing space for growth, change, and authentic expression of their evolving values and priorities. As their second year of independence unfolded, William and Catherine began to face new challenges they hadn't anticipated during the early stages of their transition. The initial excitement of freedom had settled into the deeper work of building a sustainable life, and some aspects proved more difficult than others. The honeymoon period of their new existence was giving way to more complex realities that tested their resolve in unexpected ways. The children, now fully settled in their new schools, had begun asking more sophisticated questions about their family's choices. George, approaching his teenage years, started to understand the full scope of what they had given up and occasionally wondered aloud about the life he might have lived as a future king. These conversations required delicate handling, helping him understand that their decision was about creating better options for all of them, not about rejecting something inherently wrong with royal service. Charlotte's natural confidence had blossomed in their new environment, but she also struggled with some aspects of their changed circumstances. Her friends' families lived very different lives, and sometimes she felt caught between worlds in ways that were difficult to explain. Catherine worked hard to help her daughter understand that feeling different wasn't the same as being better or worse than others, just unique in ways that could be either challenging or advantageous depending on the situation. Financial pressures, while not overwhelming, proved more persistent than they had expected. The income from their various projects was substantial but irregular, requiring careful planning and budgeting skills they were still developing. The learning curve of managing their own financial affairs after years of institutional support was steeper than anticipated, involving everything from understanding tax obligations to planning for the children's future education costs. William's environmental consulting work had grown into something more substantial than either of them had expected. What began as selective projects had evolved into a small but thriving business that demanded increasing amounts of his time and energy. The work was satisfying and aligned with his values, but the pressure of building something from scratch while supporting his family created stresses he hadn't experienced during his royal years. Catherine's involvement with the children's mental health charity had led to opportunities she never could have pursued as a working royal. She was invited to speak at international conferences, collaborate on research projects, and contribute to policy discussions in ways that felt more substantive than her previous ceremonial roles. The work required her to develop new skills and expertise, challenging her intellectually in ways that felt both exciting and occasionally overwhelming. Their marriage continued to evolve in their new circumstances, but not without some growing pains. The pressures of financial responsibility, career development, and hands-on parenting created different kinds of stress than they had faced in royal life. They had to learn new ways of supporting each other through challenges that didn't come with institutional guidance or established protocols for resolution. The media attention had settled into more predictable patterns, but it brought ongoing complications. Photographers still appeared at school events and local gatherings, creating awkward situations for other parents and sometimes making the children's friends uncomfortable. The family had to develop strategies for participating in community life while protecting both their own privacy and that of the people around them. Public speaking engagements offered good income, but required careful consideration of which opportunities aligned with their values versus those that seemed designed primarily to capitalize on their former royal status. Catherine found herself turning down lucrative offers that felt exploitative, while accepting others that allowed her to contribute meaningfully to causes she cared about. The process of making these distinctions required developing new criteria for decision-making. William struggled occasionally with questions about his identity and purpose outside the royal framework. Having been raised from birth to fulfill a specific role, the freedom to choose his own path sometimes felt overwhelming, rather than liberating. Therapy helped him work through these feelings, but the process of reconstructing his sense of self was ongoing and sometimes emotionally challenging. The extended royal family relationships remained complicated, with some members supportive of their choices while others maintained distance or expressed ongoing disappointment. Holiday celebrations and family gatherings required careful navigation, particularly when the children wanted to maintain connections with cousins and relatives who remained within the royal structure. These family dynamics added emotional complexity to what was already a challenging transition. Community integration had been more successful than they had dared hope. Their neighbors had gradually begun treating them as ordinary residents rather than celebrities, though special occasions still brought increased attention. The children's participation in local sports teams and school activities helped normalize their presence in the community, but there were always reminders that their family situation remained unique. Catherine's relationship with her own family had deepened during this period, as she found herself relying more heavily on her parents and siblings for emotional support and practical advice. Having people in their lives who had known them before the royal years provided important grounding and perspective during moments of uncertainty or self-doubt. The couple had begun discussing the possibility of having another child, a conversation that would have been heavily scrutinized and planned by others during their royal years. Now the decision was entirely their own, based on their desires as a family and their assessment of their ability to provide the kind of life they wanted for all their children. The freedom to make such personal choices privately felt precious, and sometimes overwhelming work-life balance proved to be an ongoing challenge as both William and Catherine pursued meaningful careers while maintaining their commitment to active parenting. Without the army of staff that had supported their royal duties, they had to develop new systems for managing household responsibilities, work obligations, and family time. The learning process involved plenty of trial and error. Financial planning for the long term required expertise they were still developing. Questions about retirement savings, college funds, and investment strategies were completely new territory for people who had never had to consider such matters. They worked with financial advisors to understand options and develop strategies, but the responsibility for these decisions felt both empowering and occasionally daunting. The children's relationships with their royal cousins required ongoing attention as the families navigated different lifestyles and expectations. Maintaining these connections while helping their own children understand why their family had chosen a different path required delicate conversations and careful boundary setting. International travel, once managed entirely by palace staff, now required the same planning and preparation as any other family. Passport renewals, visa applications, and travel insurance became their responsibility, along with finding ways to visit interesting places without creating media circuses that would disrupt other travelers or local communities as they approached the second anniversary of their decision to step back from royal life. Both William and Catherine felt a growing sense of confidence in their ability to create the life they wanted for their family. The challenges were real and ongoing, but they were challenges they had chosen rather than obligations imposed by circumstances beyond their control. The difference felt significant and worth the ongoing effort required to build something entirely their own. 2 years had passed since that pivotal morning when William and Catherine made their announcement to the world, and the transformation in their lives had been more profound than either could have imagined. Standing in their garden on a crisp autumn evening, watching their children play football on the lawn they had planted themselves, the couple reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of quiet contentment. The anniversary of their decision had come and gone with surprisingly little fanfare. The media marked the occasion with retrospective articles and analysis, but for William and Catherine, it was simply another day in a life that had become wonderfully ordinary in many ways. They celebrated privately that evening, sharing a bottle of wine and remembering the fear and uncertainty they had felt exactly 2 years earlier. George had grown into a thoughtful teenager who seemed genuinely happy with the path his family had chosen. His initial questions about their decision had evolved into deeper conversations about duty, authenticity, and what it meant to serve others. He had developed his own interests in environmental science, inspired partly by his father's work but clearly driven by his own curiosity and passion. The pressure of being a future king was gone, replaced by the more normal challenges of adolescence and self-discovery. Charlotte had flourished in ways that might not have been possible within the constraints of royal protocol. Her natural leadership abilities found expression through student government and community volunteer projects. She had organized a successful fundraising campaign for local animal shelters and seemed to have inherited her parents' instinct for meaningful service, but on her own terms and in her own style. Louis, now fully settled in his new school, had developed into a confident, outgoing child whose joy and simple pleasures reminded his parents daily of what they had been trying to protect when they made their difficult choice. His laughter still echoed through their home, but now it mixed with the sounds of ordinary family life, rather than competing with the formal atmosphere of royal residences. William's environmental consulting business had grown beyond his wildest expectations, attracting clients who valued his expertise and passion rather than his former title. He had developed a reputation for innovative approaches to sustainability challenges and had been invited to speak at conferences around the world. The work provided both financial security and deep personal satisfaction, proving that meaningful professional success was possible outside the royal framework. Catherine's involvement in children's mental health advocacy had evolved into something approaching a second career. She had co-authored research papers, testified before parliamentary committees, and helped develop programs that were being implemented internationally. The recognition she received was based entirely on her contributions and expertise, creating a sense of professional accomplishment that felt entirely her own. Their marriage had deepened in ways they hadn't expected. The removal of external pressures and formal constraints had allowed them to rediscover each other as individuals, rather than public figures fulfilling predetermined roles. They had learned to navigate ordinary marital challenges without palace staff mediating their disagreements or public expectations influencing their decisions. The relationship felt more authentic and resilient than ever before. Financial independence had become a reality rather than just a goal. Through careful planning, hard work, and some initial luck with investment decisions, they had achieved the security they needed to maintain their chosen lifestyle without depending on royal funding or exploiting their former status. The satisfaction of earning their own way felt transformative after years of institutional support. Community integration had exceeded their hopes. They were now genuinely accepted as residents rather than celebrities, though special occasions still brought reminders of their unique background. Catherine served on the school board. William coached youth football, and both participated in local fundraising efforts with the same commitment they had once brought to royal patronages. The difference was that now they could choose their level of involvement based on personal interest rather than constitutional obligation. The children's friends came and went from their home with the casual frequency that marked genuine acceptance. Birthday parties, study groups, and sleepovers had become routine events that required no special security arrangements or media management. The house often filled with the cheerful chaos of childhood in ways that felt both normal and precious to parents who understood how rare such normalcy had been in their own lives. Extended family relationships had found new equilibrium after the initial period of adjustment. Some royal relatives remained distant, but others had developed deeper connections based on genuine affection rather than formal obligation. The children maintained relationships with their royal cousins, but without the complex dynamics that had once surrounded every family interaction. Travel had become an adventure rather than a carefully orchestrated series of official engagements. Family vacations were planned based on where they wanted to go, rather than diplomatic necessity or constitutional requirement. The freedom to explore new places without extensive advance planning or security considerations felt revolutionary after years of highly managed movement. Professional recognition continued to grow for both William and Catherine, but in fields they had chosen based on personal passion rather than inherited duty. Awards and acknowledgments came from colleagues who valued their actual contributions rather than their titles or connections. The satisfaction of earning respect through competence and dedication felt more meaningful than any ceremonial honor they had received during their royal years. As evening settled over their garden and the children reluctantly came inside for dinner, William and Catherine exchanged a look that conveyed everything they had learned about love, courage, and the price of authenticity. The farewell hug that had once symbolized the end of their royal life now seemed like the beginning of something even more valuable, a life built on their own choices, sustained by their own efforts and defined by their own values. The world had indeed held its breath during those crucial moments 2 years earlier, but now it had moved on to other stories, other crises, other moments of human drama. For William and Catherine, the most important audience had always been the 3 children who called them simply Mom and Dad, and who would grow up knowing that sometimes the most important act of love is the courage to choose an authentic life, even when that choice requires leaving everything familiar behind. Their story had become one of transformation rather than abandonment, of growth rather than retreat, of building something new rather than simply walking away from something old. The millions who had once held their breath were now witnessing something perhaps even more remarkable: the quiet success of 2 people who had found the courage to define happiness on their own terms.